for joining this guide for parents to the appeals process for A-level and GCSE results this summer. My name is Helen Hogben and I'm an Education and Employment Law Barrister at Trinity Chambers. I'm also a mother of a teenager who is about to get his A-level results this Thursday, so I feel your pain, and like many of you, I'm apprehensive about what to expect on Thursday in terms of outcome, given the unusual times we now find ourselves in. But if your child does end up in the unfortunate situation of not getting the A-level results which he or she expected, then this webinar hopes to outline what your options are in assessing whether there's scope for challenging the decision, and if there is, what you need to do about it. Now, the assessment and appeals process that has been developed by Ofqual, the exam regulator, across the last few months has been hugely controversial. And in my view, it is inevitable that it will be subject to legal challenge by way of judicial review. It seems a long time ago now, doesn't it, since the Secretary of State for Education announced in March that exams would be cancelled this summer. And in so doing, he stated that the government's priority was to ensure affected students can move on to as planned to the next stage of their lives, including going to university, starting apprenticeships, starting work, and so on. And he went on to state that if students didn't believe that the correct process for the calculation of their exam results had been followed in their case, they would be able to appeal on that basis. The idea behind the new framework is that exam boards would ask teachers, who after all know their students best, to submit their professional judgment about the grade that they believed the student would have received if exams had gone ahead. But since March, and after a period of consultation, Ofqual has introduced a statistical standardisation model, a kind of algorithm, if you like, into the process for the calculation of results, which allows for grades awarded by schools to be adjusted based on factors such as the performance of children at the same school in previous years. Ofqual haven't released the precise technical detail of the standardisation model which they've used, and they've indicated that they will not do so until after A-level results day on the 13th of August. So in order to effectively navigate the appeals process in these unprecedented times, it is important to first understand how your child's grades have been calculated this summer. Last month, Ofqual issued guidance to teachers, students, parents and carers, which included a summary of how the grading and standardisation process for this year's exams will work. A link to the full guidance can be found at the end of this webinar, but this is how it will work in broad terms. The first part is centre assessment. This comprises two elements. First, grade. Your school or college was asked to make a fair and objective judgment of the grade they believed your child would have achieved if they sat their exams this year. And the school will have taken into account evidence such as your child's mock exam results, homework, and coursework, and so on. The second piece of information they had to submit to the exam board, along with student grades, is the rank order. The rank order of students within each grade and in each subject. So for example, if Aisha, Tom and Sam are all allocated a grade B in English, the school was then required to rank those students from the most secure in a grade B to the least secure. And that information was then submitted to the exam board. But here comes the controversial bit, the standardisation process. When those centre or school assessments were received by the exam boards, a statistical model was then used to standardise results between centres and over time. It takes into account historical outcomes for the school or centre, prior attainment of this year's students and the prior attainment of previous cohorts of students within that school, and the expected national grade distribution for the subject given the prior attainment of the national entry. Now, the historical data that will be used in relation to AS and A levels will be from 2017, 2018 and 2019. Now, this brand new extraordinary system for this year in terms of assessing exam results gives rise to a number of potential issues. First of all, what about those talented outliers? Those high achieving but disadvantaged students who perhaps may attend poor performing schools. Those students may well be unfairly penalised by the use of historical data. Take, for example, Aisha. Aisha's school has submitted a centre assessment to the exam board that indicates Aisha was likely to achieve 3 A stars at A level. That was based on data such as the mock exam results that Aisha achieved, her consistent coursework and homework, and so on. But Aisha attends a poor performing school, and in her A-level subjects, the highest grade achieved across the previous 3 years has been a grade B. So it's quite likely that Aisha will be penalised unfairly because of the introduction of historical data for her school. There is some evidence to support that this may happen, given the Scottish Higher results which came out last week. In Scotland, the pass rate for pupils within the most deprived data zones was reduced by 15.2% compared to 6.9% for pupils from the most affluent backgrounds. Another issue arising from the new system of assessment is the risk of unconscious bias affecting grading and rank that could occur at the school centre assessment stage. In fact, the chair of the Commons Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon, has expressed serious worries about the model developed by Ofqual and noted that there was a risk that it will lead to unfair bias and discrimination against already disadvantaged groups, people from a BIM background, students with special educational needs, disadvantaged and looked after children. The third group of students that could be negatively affected by the new framework are those that I've heard referred to as the Just Williams. Those students whose behaviour and attitude in class often disguises their ability. They're the type of students that pull it out of the bag at the 11th hour by working hard in the months leading up to exams and tend to exceed their predicted grades. John Neild, a former principal examiner for AQA, has expressed concerns that white working class boys in particular could be adversely affected by the new system. Ofqual have conceded that a substantial number of A-level students on Thursday will see the grades given by their school downgraded in at least one of their subjects. For some, this could make the difference between achieving their first choice university or not. For others, it may well be the difference between passing and failing. So if you or your child are affected in this way, how can you appeal? On the 11th of June, Ofqual issued its regulatory framework, which set out the requirements for exam boards during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this included the grounds upon which you can appeal. Again, a link to that framework can be found at the end of this webinar. The first and probably the most important point to note is that appeal can only be brought by your school and not by the student as an individual. It can be brought on any one or more of the following grounds. First, that the exam board didn't apply procedures consistently or that procedures were not followed properly and fairly. Secondly, that the exam board used the wrong data in applying the process which calculated exam results. And third, that a result generated by applying the process was incorrectly issued by the exam board in respect of one or more students. So what is the wrong type of data that could give rise to a successful ground of appeal? Well, the original COVID framework issued by Ofqual in June included 3 specific examples of data which will be considered to be wrong data in any appeal. And these are very straightforward. First, where the centre or the school has provided incorrect assessment grades and rank order information to the exam board. Put simply, this is where your school makes a mistake in the information that it's submitted. It may be that it has confused, for example, two children with the same or similar names. If there has been a genuine mistake by the school, then the COVID framework allows for a shortened time frame for appeals and the correction of the result without the need to carry through the full appeal process. The second element that could amount to wrong data is where the exam board has used an incorrect data set for the purposes of calculating results. This is where the exam board has made a mistake. And it may well be that it covers the type of situation where an exam board has mixed up two schools with similar sounding names. And again, the shortened process should be followed in those circumstances to correct any errors. And the third type of wrong data envisaged in June by Ofqual was where the exam board has introduced an error into the data set it used for the purposes of calculating results. Now, we know that as part of this process, exam boards will use a number of different types of data in the calculation of results, such as historic data, prior attainment, and so on. So this covers situations where errors occur when the exam board transposes that data into its own system. Again, this is something that schools will be able to spot when they receive information disclosed to them by the exam board, and the shortened appeal process should be used to correct any errors. But what we can see from those original three scenarios set out by Ofqual in June is that the original framework only allowed for appeals by schools on very limited grounds. And as I've already mentioned, this has attracted a great deal of criticism from many quarters. Last Thursday, however, a week before exam results come out, Ofqual issued further guidance, which included other examples of what could amount to the use of wrong data by the exam board as a ground of appeal. A school can now appeal if it believes that the historical data used for standardisation was not a reliable basis for predicting its 2020 results. And that can occur in cases where there is a substantial difference between this year's cohorts and previous cohorts. Examples of when this could happen include where a school has changed from a single sex to a mixed school, and this year's cohort is the first to take exams after the change. It could encompass situations where the school has had a leadership, governance or organisational change, and it can show evidence of an increase in GCSE and A-level results after that change occurred. In terms of the use of historical data, if some form of momentous event at school has significantly disrupted learning for a prolonged period for previous cohorts of students, that could also amount to the use of wrong data for the purposes of calculating results. And finally, if a school can show that this year's results were likely to show a very different pattern of grades to previous years, that could amount to wrong data. Now, Ofqual also issued guidance to students last Thursday, which indicated that this could include circumstances where a school or college is concerned about the way the statistical model could affect individual high ability students who might be expected to receive results that are out of line with the school's historical results. So it potentially touches on those talented outlier students. Ofqual have made it clear that clear and objective evidence will be needed to establish that there's a substantive difference between cohorts. And unfortunately, once again, this puts students at poor performing or improving schools at a disadvantage in comparison to those good or outstanding schools, perhaps and more often in affluent areas, that are well governed and have effective and robust procedures in place for tracking student performance over time. Ofqual has also made it clear that an appeal will only succeed if the difference in performance between this year's year group and previous year groups would be likely to have actually affected the calculation of this year's results to a sufficiently measurable degree. Furthermore, the guidance indicates that an appeal of this nature should only succeed where the exam boards can identify a method to standardise results which allows for the substantive difference, for example, by adjusting its statistical model by excluding some historical data, and which it considers is more likely to produce accurate results than the original results. If the new results are no more likely to be accurate than the original, Ofqual say that there will be no adequate basis to conclude that the initial results were affected by the wrong data. So if you're concerned that your child has been unfairly penalised by the application of the new COVID framework for the calculation of exam results, what should you do next? Well, the first thing to do is gather all of the key information that you need. Exam boards must have arrangements in place to provide sufficient information to schools to enable them to consider whether or not to appeal. And Ofqual have made it clear that this should include the centre assessment grades and rank order information that were recorded and used by the exam board, historical learner data for the relevant year held by the exam board, and the profile of prior attainment for the 2020 cohort and the prior attainment profiles of other relevant previous cohorts held and used by the exam board. Once that information has been provided by the exam board to the school, it will be for the school to decide whether or not to disclose some or all of that information to any students on whose behalf it is considering the possibility of appeal. Obviously, that will be subject to the school's own obligations in terms of data protection. The second thing to do when you have that information is to ask the school to check whether any errors have been made in submitting your grade and rank order. If there has been, then appeal to the exam board using the shortened process should be commenced as quickly as possible. And the third thing to do, if there haven't been any errors made by your school in submitting your grade and rank order, is to work with your school to determine whether there are grounds for appeal. If your school refuses to submit an appeal on your behalf, it must have a process in place that allows for someone else at the school to review that decision. And if it doesn't, then you can use your school's complaints procedure to address this with them in the first instance. Now, it is important to remember that there is no right of appeal simply because you disagree with your grade and rank order that school has submitted to the exam board. However, if you think that your grade and rank order was influenced by some form of bias or discrimination, whilst this won't form a ground of appeal, this could amount to malpractice or maladministration. Of course, receiving a grade lower than the one you expected is not in itself evidence of bias or discrimination, and you would need to show evidence of something specific or something surprising about the grade or rank order that you've been allocated, which calls for an explanation that your school has been unable to give. And if you're pursuing an allegation of bias or discrimination, you need to raise this first with your school or college. And then if you feel that the matter has not been dealt with or not resolved, then raise it with the exam board. Ofqual's guidance to students gives examples of the types of case which may look like malpractice, and a link to that guidance can be found at the end of this webinar. If the exam board thinks there is a reasonable basis to suspect malpractice, it will conduct an investigation. But because it's a very serious allegation, it will give your teacher the opportunity to explain why they disagree with your allegation. And if the exam board then thinks after that investigation that there has been malpractice or maladministration, it will then go on to consider whether the results it issued to you were wrong, and if so, whether it should change them. So to sum up, these are clearly uncertain times for students and parents, but what I can predict with some confidence is that there will be a legal challenge to this year's assessment process, in particular the lack of any right to an individual appeal if grades are adjusted downwards during the standardisation process. There is a host of resources available to you if you're concerned about your results and wish to challenge them, and a list of these will appear at the end of this webinar. One final point I'd like to make is that education is a great leveller, and it is important that challenges to the Ofqual assessment process, which, let's face it, is likely to affect the most disadvantaged groups in our society, are not simply reserved for those who can afford it, and in the words of the chair of the Education Select Committee, for the well-heeled and the sharp-elbowed. If you feel that your child has been negatively affected by the new COVID framework for the calculation of results, then please do not hesitate to get in touch with us here at Trinity Chambers, and we'll do our very best to help and point you in the right direction. All the very best and good luck for Thursday. Thanks for listening.